Railways as a form of public transport will soon end 2 centuries of existence. The first public transport service by rail was organized by a steam locomotive called locomotion between English cities of Stockton and Darlington back in 1825. Since its beginnings, the railway system of Europe has gone through different stages of development, from sudden expansion and widespread use, through the period of stagnation and accumulation of debts, to a long-lasting decline which required radical measures and reform. Now, in the context of Green Deal and modern environmental concerns, it seems like the railway is on the doorstep of a great comeback. Welcome to Railways Explained, first educational and comprehensive YouTube channel dedicated exclusively to railways. Our today's topic is not the future of European railways, but rather something we need to understand if we want to understand future: the past. Please keep in mind that this is a very comprehensive and complicated topic, but we'll try to explain its most important parts as simple as possible. In order to do so, we will briefly present historical development of European railways by discussing their 4 characteristic periods: the period of development and construction of railways, the period of nationalization and the establishment of state railway companies, the period of stagnation and decline, and eventually the period of reform and the establishment of single European railway market. At the same time, this video should help you understand why European railways had to be reformed and restructured in previous decades and why are they organized the way they are today. Let's waste no time and begin with the first period. The period of development and construction of railways characteristic for the 19th century can mainly be described by the motivation of private investors to build railways. Rail transport enabled them to generate higher profits, having in mind the convenience of railway system for mass transport of goods, compared to other modes of transport available at the time. On the other side, the governments of most European countries have concluded that the construction of railway lines would be too expensive endeavor for themselves, so they simply decided to hand it over to private sector. But what will in the future turn out as a problem, it was done almost without any legal or institutional framework. Any investor or individual who built railways have been doing that according to its own rules. This made European railways mutually incompatible, even within the same country, making the organization of traffic on more than one line a quite complicated and inefficient task. In the Great Britain, for example, anyone who had sufficient financial resources or the ability to borrow could set up a railway company, raise the capital, and it only had to obtain a bill from the parliament in order to start construction. After issuing the railway bill, the parliament only had one job: to enable the purchase of land. As you might guess, this process was not based on any strategic document which would assess or express the transport needs of the whole country. Anyway, these periods of huge investments in railways in late 1830s, mid-1840s and early 1860s were popularly called the railway mania and resulted in a fact that by 1871 the Great Britain had a network of 20,000 kilometers of railways. As you can see on the screen, the share of privately owned railways compared to the state-owned was quite significant in most European countries. This was the case from the very beginnings all the way to the beginning of the First World War. Let's summarize this. The railways started developing exclusively for the needs of private investors, and as networks started growing and railways showed their full potential, both for industry and military defense, it was realized that without the control of the government, which means the strategic plans on state level, unified technical parameters and harmonized technology and traffic organization, further growth of railways and the economies is not quite possible. Already by the end of 19th century, it became clear that the railways will be the most dominant mode of transport in Europe, so the government started changing their attitude towards the railways. At first, they started imposing regulations with the aim to limit monopoly and to provide minimum levels of service. Also, many governments imposed regulated tariffs in order to provide cheap prices for certain categories of users. Then, at the beginning of the 20th century, and to a greater extent after the First World War, when in addition to the transport and market potential, their strategic importance was also realized, the nationalization of private railway companies became inevitable, which will be discussed in the next segment of our video. The beginning of the 20th century also brought the First World War, which caused enormous damage of public goods, including the railways. Bearing in mind that the lack of economic activity after the war and high costs of repairs were too much for private investors, the process of taking over the railways by the states was only speeded up. Soon after, another world war broke out, and the railway infrastructure suffered enormous damage one more time. However, after the war is over, the railways played a central role in the recovery of Europe's economy, and therefore giving the highest priority to reconstruction and construction of railways was quite a reasonable move. This was supposed to enable the exploitation of natural resources badly needed for realization of industrialization plans. The centrally managed railways owned by the states were perfectly in line with centrally planned economies and also perfectly suitable for the transport of main types of commodities produced by those economies at the time. Railway systems were now well developed and centrally planned, but without coordinated interstate planning, this progress was to a large extent limited to the national borders. This resulted in a large number of restrictions and obstacles that primarily affected the seamless and efficient international traffic. These inconsistencies can be best portrayed by the existence of 5 different track gauges, 5 classes of axle loads, 21 signaling system, 6 types of railway electrification, and an endless number of different national regulations. Similar to the period when private investors ran the railways, state ownership also made significant problems after a while. As we explained, it produced a monopoly structure of the railway sector with national railway companies who lacked motivation for further expansion on the market. Just to remind you, this was a period when European Economic and Steel Community was formed, followed by the European Economic Community, which will later result in European Union as we know it today. As it was intended, this created the unbreakable link between different national economies of Europe, and this turned out to be a quite beneficial decision for European economy. The problem was, while this was happening, railways remained fortified within the borders of their respective countries. Then, since 1960s, a rapid expansion and development of road and air traffic happened, which was one of the key points in the history of railways. In combination with few other factors such as the affordability of cars and trucks and the change in the structure of produced commodities, i.e. the shift from heavy industry to finer products, this caused a start of a slow and unstoppable decline in the railway's share of transported freight and passengers. The monopoly structure and the rigidity of the railway sector prevented railways to even try to adapt to new market conditions. Railways, continuing to function as they did before, actually started accumulating significant amounts of debts. At that point, this became a huge problem for politicians who were now in favor of the cheaper and more efficient road transport, given the fact it had a developed motorway network at its disposal and it is able to provide a door-to-door service. In order to solve this problem and keep railways in life, European Union decided that the reform and liberalization of the railway market was the only way. The main idea was to erase national borders within the EU by establishing a unified institutional and legislative framework that should enable efficient and unified rail transport market. Then the market should be liberalized, which means the competition should be introduced with the aim to improve the quality of the railway transport services. The main goal of European Union can be reflected in the idea of free movement of people, goods, services and capital. However, this idea could never be achieved without the revision of old European transport policy, and this was well known among the European policymakers. In that sense, the old European transport policy has been revised and a new one has been established. It was focused around the integration of national transport systems into the common European transport market and the efforts to eliminate national and technological borders for all modes of transport. In essence, the idea was to move from this to this. Regarding the railways, which were the most problematic, these processes began with the enforcement of a new legal framework in 1991. The basic idea of so-called First Railway Package was to enable the change from monopoly to liberalized railway market, thus enabling competition which would result in the improvement of quality of the railway services. This was done through the unbundling of national railway companies and enabling non-discriminatory access to railway infrastructure to all interested railway companies, regardless of whether they are state or privately owned. This unbundling was done based on the core railway activities, and it envisaged the formation of infrastructure managers and railway undertakings. In that sense, infrastructure managers are companies in charge for maintenance, renewal and construction of railway infrastructure and organization and regulation of railway traffic. In most cases, they remain financed by the state and under their direct control, given the fact that management of rail infrastructure have been recognized as natural monopoly. On the other hand, for the transport of freight and passengers, railway undertakings have been formed, or better said, have been separated from the old national companies. Railway undertakings for the transport of freight found themselves on the free transport market and, in most cases, it turned out to be a good decision, given the fact that these companies have been making profits since their formation. Also, the competition really improved the quality of rail transport services. At the same time, the passenger railway undertakings are in quite different and more complex situation. Considering the railway passenger transport is mostly unprofitable, which doesn't mean it is not needed and it doesn't have its purpose on the transport market, the EU decided to establish a contractual relation between the states and other competent authorities on one side and the passenger railway undertakings on the other. This is done in a form of public service obligation contract, which should be established for all unprofitable services, for which the company, if guided by commercial interest, would not even accept to operate. For these services, in case when competent authorities decide they fall within the public interest, those authorities are obliged to pay a compensation to the relevant railway undertaking. However, in return, competent authorities have the right to require strict service standards which are now closely monitored and controlled through the framework of PSO contract. Any failure of the railway undertaking, such as cancellation of the service or delay, might result in penalty as defined within the contract. On the other side, all profitable services should be performed and developed on the free market without any intervention of the state. There is also the aspect of tendering of PSO contracts, which is the process that should force the railway undertaking to optimize and improve their businesses. Another important segment of rail reform was a decision to guarantee equal access rights to all interested state and private railway undertakings in regards to the railway infrastructure. In this regard, all interested railway undertakings which fulfill all legal and technical requirements as well as pay a defined price to railway infrastructure manager can access the railway infrastructure and organize a railway service. This price, called the track access charge, represents the income of the infrastructure manager, and it is used to cover the costs of maintenance of railway infrastructure. In addition, there is the technical aspect of the story embodied in the efforts to remove technical barriers and to achieve interoperability of different national railway systems. But explaining it would take another video on our channel. Also, as you see, the reform of European railways is a very interesting and important topic, so we think that some of its aspects, in addition to interoperability, definitely deserve to be explained in much more detail in some of the future videos on Railways Explained. If you agree, tell us in the comments below. For now, thank you very much for your attention, we hope you enjoyed and learned something new about the railways of the world. Don't forget to like this video, and for more interesting railway stories, subscribe to our channel. Goodbye.